Alright, now this is going to be our first video. This topic is going to explore French and Indian War as well as the immediate aftermath of the French and Indian War. Now, this is period 3. Remember I said at the beginning, the year in each period that starts off each period is a turning point. So for period 1, the year was 1491, and that is the natives before Columbus arrived, because we know Columbus arrived in 1492 to the New World. Period 2 starts off with 1607, and that is the founding of Jamestown. And we've explored how Jamestown has impacted really society today, especially with Bacon's Rebellion. And now period 3 is going to start with 1754, and that is the beginning of what we know as the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War. Here are the big idea questions. One big thing that we really need to understand is how the French and Indian War altered the relationship between the British and the colonists. Without the French and Indian War, there is no American Revolution. Without the American Revolution, there is no United States. That's very important to understand. Also, our other big idea is what arguments did the colonists use to resist British actions after the war, and we'll explore what some of those actions immediately following the war were. Skip that slide. Now, the French and Indian War is known as the War for the Great Empire. You have England and France that are vying to be the most powerful country in the world. What leads to the conflict? The British are going to expand into the Ohio Valley, where the French forces are located and where French people are located, as well as Native Americans who have an alliance with the French. And so we have these competing imperial powers, again, trying to be the most powerful country in the world, trying to control the fur trade, trying to control the land, because land equals resources, which equals money. At this time, the Iroquois will have an alliance with the British, but that will not last. Stay tuned. And so, in order to understand how 1763 was a turning point in British colonial relationships, and 1763 obviously is the end of the French and Indian War, because this war spans from 1754 to 1763. But in order to understand how 1763 changed things, we have to understand how this war even started in the first place, and really what America, North America, looked like prior to the war. So on this slide, you see North America in 1750. Notice how big Louisiana is, and that Louisiana is part of New France. You can look at the land that Great Britain occupies. This is land that is not only the 13 colonies, but also in Canada. And then also take a look at New Spain. Spain occupies land in what is present-day Mexico, present-day Texas, where we live, it was occupied by Spain. And also in Florida. This map is going to look drastically different in 1763. And so the first clash, basically, just know that George Washington gets his first taste of battle during the French and Indian War. He's about 21 or 22 years old, can't remember, nor does it matter. But he is stationed at Fort Necessity, which is over in the Ohio Valley area. And the French are at Fort Duquesne, along with Native American tribes such as the Delaware and the Shawnee. Now, why is this called the French and Indian War? It's called the French and Indian War because most of the Indians had an alliance with the French. And so, let me break this down. I wrote this on the board in class, but just in case you forgot, there are two sides to this war. On one side, you have the British and the American colonists. There are Native Americans that fight with the British, but not very many. Alright, so it's mainly just for simplicity, just think the British and the colonists are on one side. On the other side of the war, you have France, a bunch of Native Americans, and in 1761, Spain will join the war. And they're going to join on the side of the French. Now, the reason that they join is really two reasons. They want revenge against England because England defeated them under Queen Elizabeth way back in the 1580s. Now, in addition to that, there's a cultural relationship that they have with France because they're both Catholic nations. And Great Britain is predominantly Protestant. Now, in 1754, there will be the attempt to unify the colonies, and that is made by Benjamin Franklin. He sets out to form this Albany Plan of Union. He believes that it's important for the colonies to unite against a common enemy, and in 1754, the common enemy would be the French. They feel as though the French are threatening their existence. And really, what this war is going to be about is a war to defend the American colonists. And so, Benjamin Franklin, he hosts this Albany Congress where he pulls all these representatives together. Representatives from Pennsylvania, Maryland, New York, as well as the New England colonies. New England being Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. Now, you can see here in the woodcut, the join or die woodcut, that this is an attempt to kind of lure these colonists so that they understand that they are stronger together. This join or die woodcut is created by Benjamin Franklin. Ultimately, though, his plan fails. The Albany Congress never really comes to fruition. The Iroquois, who they were supposed to try to form an alliance with, decide that they don't really like the colonists very much, and so they're going to break off their relationship with Britain as a result of that. And they're going to threaten to trade with France. And so the Iroquois are going to basically be trying to play the British and the French off of each other because they realize their influence and they realize the power that they have because they can control so much of the fur trade and because they've won the Beaver Wars, which we studied in period 2. Now, French and Indian War, the main things that you need to know as far as a timeline, in 1755, Britain tries to eliminate the French from North America, and so it starts in the Ohio Valley where Braddock goes and attacks the French forces as well as Native American forces, and they're mostly successful. They're able to push a lot of the French forces out of Louisiana, which is a huge, huge victory for the British. In 1756, the war is officially declared, and Native Americans are fighting on both sides, mostly the French side, but they're fighting on both sides and they're exploited by both sides. The Native Americans are basically going to choose a side that they think will benefit them the most. And for the most part, they think that they have more to gain if the French win this war. And like I said earlier, in 1761, Spain will become an ally of France. Now here you can see some of the differences between the British and the colonists, a lot of cultural differences. In terms of methods of fighting, the colonists use guerrilla warfare, hiding in bushes, jumping out of trees and attacking, stuff like that. Very unorthodox form of war. Whereas the British used a very traditional form of war, and you guys saw Mr. Baker last year, line up and they'd stand in a line, they'd shoot, and they'd take a step over. And that's how they fought. That's just kind of a traditional marching formation. They do a bayonet charge like that, etc. The colonists are also not very disciplined, whereas the British are very, very disciplined. The colonists tend to be more casual and would be considered non-professional, where the British are very formal, kind of these prima donnas, eating their crumpets and drinking their tea. Now, the result of the French and Indian War. It impacts the three countries in different ways. First of all, we'll look at France. France loses all of their Canadian land. That would be places like Quebec. Now, some of you guys may know in parts of Canada they speak French. That's because France used to control that part. And so France loses Quebec. They lose most of their empire in India. That's not very important. I don't even know why I put that there, to be honest. I'm sorry. But they also lose claims to lands east of the Mississippi River as well as Louisiana, right, which would be west of the Mississippi River. And so they pretty much lost all of their land for the most part in North America. Spain, on the other hand, they're going to lose Florida. So England's going to take over Florida, but they're going to pick up the land that France had west of the Mississippi River, which is Louisiana. So Spain gets Louisiana from England, and we can assume that England gave Spain Louisiana just kind of as a peace offering, but also because England probably didn't want to deal with the Native American problem. It costs money to defend the colonists from Native Americans, and England is in a lot of debt because of this war. Now, what does England gain from the war, according to the Treaty of Paris? England's going to get all of the French land in Canada, so now Quebec is part of England. They get exclusive rights to the Caribbean slave trade, and those are the big things that England gains from the Treaty of Paris. When the Treaty of Paris is what ends the war. Now here's a map of North America in 1763. Notice the balance of power shift. Here you have Quebec, which is now in control of Great Britain. This disputed area earlier, there was this disputed area where some of it was French and some of it was British. That disputed area no longer exists because Great Britain owns all of that now. Notice Louisiana is now part of New Spain. And you really have to zoom in and, get a microscope to really figure out where French land is. But keep in mind, the French will remember this war and they will seek revenge. Now, the effects of the war on England. First of all, it increased England's empire. Secondly, it increased England's debt. And thirdly, you have England start to seek more control over the colonies. Now, what does that mean? That means that salutary neglect is over. Remember, salutary neglect started after the Glorious Revolution when William and Mary came to power and they said, we got too many issues in our own country. We really don't have time to be messing with these colonies. And so they decided that they weren't really going to consistently enforce the laws from Parliament. Now, because England is in so much debt, they need to enforce those laws. And so they will enforce those laws after really going for a significant period not enforcing them. So that's going to meet some backlash from the colonists. Now, one of the other things that they do is they start to add new taxes, which we'll explore in a bit. But it's very, very important to understand that the French and Indian War causes the American Revolution. Again, without the French and Indian War, there is no United States. Now, the effect of the war on the colonists are twofold. First of all, for the first time, they're united against a common enemy, which that common enemy was France. Did I say enemy or enemy? I think I said enemy. Hopefully I said enemy. Anyway, moving on. They also have these very British feelings. I'm sorry, very, very bitter feelings towards the British. And that's going to intensify, especially after the war, when the British end salutary neglect and start to add all of these taxes. And we'll talk specifically about these taxes in a bit. Now, right at the tail end of the war, as soon as the Native Americans realize that the British have won, they are not happy with that. They're concerned about what that means for their land. And so in 1763, some Native Americans will attack Fort Detroit. And you can see a kind of this sketch or this painting of the Native American leader. His name was Chief Pontiac. Now, in order to put this rebellion down, the British decided that they were going to use biological warfare. They gifted to the Native Americans some blankets that were infected with smallpox. Now, these blankets did not come from Fort Detroit. They came from Fort Pittsburgh, or Fort Pitt. And so the Native Americans assumed this was like this peace offering, right? Like, they didn't really think anything of it. And because their immune system was not built to deal with smallpox, smallpox came from Europe. So they weren't necessarily used to dealing with this illness. So it killed Native Americans fairly quickly. It didn't kill all of them, but it killed a lot of them. And so this is how they put down Pontiac's rebellion. Here's a map of Pontiac's rebellion. You can kind of see where the different battles were, and where the different battle sites. You can see where Fort Detroit is. Here is Fort Pitt, right here. So there's a pretty significant distance between Fort Detroit and Fort Pitt. So you can kind of understand maybe why the Native Americans were a little bit more trusting of Fort Pitt. Now, ultimately, they don't get what they want, right? Like, the Native Americans want to protect their land. They lose this conflict. They lose Pontiac's rebellion. But they do gain something. The British don't want to deal with defending the colonists. And so the British passed what's known as the Proclamation Line of 1763. And if you look at this map here, there's this red line. What that means is The colonists cannot settle past that red line. And so specifically, the colonists cannot settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. So this red line goes along the Appalachian Mountains, and if they settle or attempt to settle past the Appalachian Mountains, that will be considered in violation of British law. Now, why did the British do this? Because they don't want to pay for the defense of the colonists. They're in debt, and the colonists are arrogant, and they think that they have this God-given right to continue to spread west. Now, how does this impact the colonists? The colonists are pissed off because, again, they're used to salutary neglect, but on top of that, they feel as though the only reason Great Britain won the French and Indian War is because of them. Even though that's not true at all, but that's how they feel, right? So they're kind of feeling themselves. They think that they are like big stuff because the French and Indian War is over and they were on the winning side, and so this is going to cause a lot of tension and a lot of kind of this pent up resistance against the British. The Paxton Boys are a representation of this kind of pent up resistance. They are a vigilante group that goes around slaughtering Native Americans at the end of the French and Indian War and also at the end of Pontiac's Rebellion. They hate Native Americans. They think they're the scum of the earth. Now, they also have some issues with government, and so they take their grievances to Benjamin Franklin at Philadelphia, who is a member of the government at that time. And Benjamin Franklin basically tells them that their concerns will be considered. Now, why do the Paxton Boys matter? They matter because they represent the hate of Native Americans, right? This hatred towards Native Americans, I should say, but also because they represent this early stage of colonists who really are rebelling against the system. Not only rebelling against, the proclamation line and rebelling against these British laws, but also taking their grievances to government. And that's essentially what the American colonists will do leading up to the American Revolution. They'll list their grievances and they'll send them to the king. George Grenville is the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and he's going to issue his program from 1763 to 1765, and these are three of the laws that pass Parliament that are part of his program. The Sugar Act places a tax on sugar. The Quartering Act, this is the first Quartering Act. There is going to be a second Quartering Act, but the first Quartering Act mainly deals with housing for British troops, British redcoats. And so this idea that you have to welcome a British redcoat into your house, but also mainly that British redcoats would be able to live in and occupy buildings that were unoccupied. And finally, there's the Stamp Act, and this is going to be very, very controversial. The Stamp Act basically said any document or any paper that is used in the colonies must have a certain stamp on it. And so you're essentially paying a tax for that stamp on the paper. Now, as a result of the Stamp Act, there's going to be what we call the Stamp Act crisis. A lot of colonists are going to rise up against the Stamp Act. And so the first thing that we see is this Sons of Liberty group emerge. They're based out of, originally they're started in New York City. We believe that Samuel Adams was secretly the leader, along with John Hancock being involved, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But Sons of Liberty are, some people would call them a patriotic group, and some people would call them terrorists. But they start to organize boycotts. They start to inflict a lot of damage on British customs agents, British officials, things like that. Now, in Virginia, the Stamp Act Congress meets. And so the Stamp Act Congress is meeting at the House of Burgesses for the purpose of discussing the Stamp Act. For the purpose of discussing the Stamp Act. And so at the Stamp Act Congress, the colonists pass what's known as the Stamp Act Resolves. And what that means is no taxation without representation. That's what they agreed to. They say that Great Britain cannot pass laws or cannot tax the colonies because the colonies don't have a representative that sits in the British Parliament. The Parliament is basically like our Congress. And so there is no physical representative of the American colonies in Parliament. And so the Founding Fathers, or at least the colonists, believe they cannot be taxed and cannot be forced to follow these laws if there's no one representing them in that government. And so there are boycotts, there are protests, and finally in 1766, Great Britain issues what's known as the Declaratory Act. The first thing that Great Britain does is they repeal the Stamp Act. So the Stamp Act will no longer be law. And so the colonists feel as though they've won a significant victory here. Now, a very important thing that Britain does is when they repeal the Stamp Act, also part of the Declaratory Act is they assert their authority to pass laws over the colonies. And so what the British will say is that the colonies are virtually represented. And what they mean by that is that even though there's no one physically sitting in Parliament that is from the colonies and is elected by the colonies, that all of the members of Parliament have the colonists' best interest at heart, because the members of Parliament see the American colonists as British. And so this is a significant divide, because the American colonists see themselves as American, but the British Parliament sees the colonists as British. Now in 1767, we're going to get the Townshend duty crisis, and so this is going to be a huge tax on various imports, right? So things that are coming into the American colonies, such as paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea. And there is a debate over internal versus external taxes. Townshend believes that these are external taxes and not an internal tax, because the colonists had serious issues with internal taxes, such as the Stamp Act. And so Townshend believes that because these are external taxes, there shouldn't be any issues. Now, in order to enforce these taxes, Great Britain sends more customs officials or customs agents to the colonies. Now, the response to the Townshend duties. John Dickinson is going to write Letter from a Pennsylvania Farmer criticizing these duties and criticizing importation. The non-importation movement is going to pick up. What that means is that they want people to boycott these goods. Let's not support these goods that are being imported by Great Britain. Let's not do business with Great Britain. That's what the non-importation movement is all about. There will also be riots against several customs agents. Even John Hancock's ship is going to be confiscated by Great Britain. And John Hancock was a smuggler. You guys probably know him as the largest signature on the Declaration of Independence. Well, he was a smuggler. That's how he made his money. And so his ship will be confiscated by the British, and eventually some radicals, more than likely the Sons of Liberty, will board that ship, damage the ship, and set it on fire. And it's probably happened at the request of John Hancock himself. And so we have to keep in mind that with this ship, yes, it was originally owned by John Hancock, but at this time the ship is in really the ownership of Great Britain. And so this sends a strong message to Great Britain, and Great Britain responds by sending 4,000 British troops to Boston. Now, for the first time, as a result of this non-importation movement, which is a result of the Townshend duties, for the first time, we start to call people patriots. Now, our next video is going to be on the road to revolution.